It's a very complicated legal landscape, and following the arrest of John Mark Carr, late in the summer after I'd left the DA's office, I decided to try to pursue a grand jury.
Nightmares in my head, I fear. Thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. One of his first moves, that's Garnett's first moves, was to turn the investigation back over to the police. Now, I think this is quite interesting. I think this was essentially washing his hands of the case because, in a way, there was nothing he could do with it. And in a way, it was giving him responsibility over it. He insists that he isn't bound by Lacy's exoneration letter, which he described as weird and a stretch. That's quite interesting, that he differs from her, and that he would be prepared to prosecute the case if he's ever presented with sufficient evidence to convict. Now, that I find a little more iffy, that statement. He's troubled by the long-term credibility issues his officers faced. Well, I think he should be, and as a result of its treatment of what is now a cold case. Well, he might be troubled by it, but he certainly didn't do much about it at the end of the day. Number two, Lacy's scathing letter to Kolar. Let's deal with that now.
It's a very complicated legal landscape, and following the arrest of John Mark Carr, late in the summer after I'd left the DA's office, I decided to try to pursue a grand jury.
So here you actually have the chief investigator hired by the DA's office doing what the DA was supposed to do. And as he says, it's a complicated legal landscape. And does he ultimately succeed? Well, he gets mired in this complicated legal landscape, unfortunately. And now let's go to a redacted version of DA Mary Lacy's letter sent to Kolar in January 2007. January 25, 2007. Dear Chief Kolar, I've reviewed your presentation on the JonBenet Ramsey murder investigation. It has also been reviewed by First Assistant District Attorney Peter McGuire, Assistant District Attorney Bill Nagel, and Chief Investigator JonBenet. We have spent substantial time examining your investigative report, summary report, and PowerPoint presentation. We have independently arrived at the same conclusions. Now this is where she gets a little bit snippy, I think. I hired you as my chief investigator in July 2005. At that time, we discussed your role regarding the Ramsey case. I was clear in my direction to you that we would follow up leads from law enforcement and other credible sources that had indicia of reliability. I think that is kind of a code for, I told you that you were here to follow leads with regard to the intruder theory. That is what I think, if you read between the lines, that's what she's saying. In other words, she's read his report, and her response is, oh, you didn't follow my lead in researching this in a certain way, except she doesn't really mention it, which I think is interesting. That decision was based upon recent history that involved Chief Investigator Bennett having to spend an inordinate amount of time responding to leads that were marginal at best. We made a deliberate decision to put our investigatory priorities on recent cases. Now, that's also not being very specific. She doesn't say we made a deliberate decision to follow leads that would take us into the intruder theory regarding recent events. Then she says, you obviously disregarded my direction. Now, he knows what she's talking about, but if this letter is published, would people really know that? You proceeded without my approval and without consulting with me. You were clearly acting outside of your defined role. When you departed from the employment of the Boulder District Attorney's Office in March of 2006, your role as an investigator with this office terminated. The Ramsey case is still under my control. So here is someone who had access to the Ramsey case, but within the DA's office. And what she is now trying to regain is control. She's trying to tell him what to do, tell him what to think, tell him how to investigate it. You have continued to proceed outside the limits of your jurisdiction. It appears you have utilized confidential information. What do you think that is in reference to? What's that confidential information? That should legally have remained under the control of my office. Now, there's a little imputed threat there as well. You may have broken the law. This is quite concerning to me and to my management staff who place their trust in your professionalism. And so here she's implying, first of all, that he's not trustworthy, and secondly, that he's been unprofessional. And I think you can turn that question back to Mary Lacy and say, has Mary Lacy been trustworthy? Has Mary Lacy been professional in terms of how she's conducted this investigation? And I think the John Mark Carr case in particular is a good area to address those questions. Now, again, what do you think that confidential information could be that Lacy is referring to here? Could it be sensitive grand jury information that only the DA's office had access to? She goes on to write, I'm going to address your presentation, although it galls me to respond. Now, if you weren't sure that Lacy has it out for this investigator, that she's going to be insulting and have a few barbs out, well, here it is. It's like the fact that I've got to respond to your presentation, it galls me. To what I consider to be an abuse of authority. Chief Investigator JonBenet, First Assistant District Attorney Peter Maguire, Assistant Attorney Bill Nagel, and myself are in agreement. Now, it's quite interesting that she's got to get support from all of these people, and not only naming them, but providing their lofty positions to support herself. And then she says, we reached this independently as to the value of your theory. She's basically saying a lot of other people differ from you. You are outnumbered in our office by the people who disagree with you. But I think there's another side to that. I think the DA's office is also outnumbered by others who disagree with them. For example, the FBI. Certain people in the FBI's office. Anyway, we are in agreement that the first portion of your presentation is based on the Boulder Police Department's case summary and facts that have been previously documented and debated. There's nothing new in terms of evidence in this presentation. The last quarter of your PowerPoint presentation, which is the final 70-plus frames, are not based on facts supported by evidence. Now, this is quite a strong allegation. You know, what you've said is not based on any facts. And I think it's quite a simple exercise to look at the frames because he talks about them. He talks about what he presented in his book and then say, is that based on facts or not? Is that based on evidence or not? And I think this is quite an interesting area where you might say, wow, how can you say that this is not based on evidence? Your theory is based on conjecture, which at times approaches pure flights of fantasy. Now, I think one can say the same thing about the intruder theory as a whole, that it's not based on facts, it's not supported by evidence, it's not, it's fanciful. Areas of it are very, very fanciful. Your conclusions are based upon suppositions and inferences with absolutely no support in evidence or in your record. Where she says, absolutely no support in evidence, that's like saying there's 0%, there's zero evidence supporting your theory. Now, even I would say the intruder theory doesn't have zero support. There's I think, a misinterpretation of evidence that is there. So, for example, there is a broken basement window, but is that actual evidence or is that misconstrued sort of factual scenario information? And so that's a difference. I don't think you can say there's no evidence whatsoever. I'm not going to take it further than that. Thank you for watching this deep dive into the Ramsey case. Look out for part 9 in this exciting 10-part series. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.